Hello, you're watching Talking Europe. The EU has long talked about unfair competition from China. After a 9-month probe, Brussels announced tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, establishing that those cars have benefited heavily from unfair subsidies, which therefore pose a threat of economic injury to electronic vehicle producers here in Europe. Well, Beijing has called the EU's move naked protectionism and says that it will harm relations and undermine global efforts on climate change. At stake for Europe is strengthening its own energy transition, as well as what the EU Commission has called de-risking from China. Well, to discuss all this, I'm joined by Pedro Marques, a Portuguese socialist and Democrat who works on foreign affairs, economic and monetary issues, and tax matters. Welcome to you. And also, I'm joined by Italian MEP Marco Campomenosi from Identity and Democracy, who works on international trade issues, among other things. Welcome to you as well.
Thank you very much.
Gentlemen, so let's explain, first of all, when do we think these tariffs are actually going to come into effect? Because there's still room for some sort of maneuver, isn't there?
Well, yes, at this stage, as it's always the case in trade policy and this kind of situations, there was already a counteraction by the Chinese, or at least a threat of a counteraction by the Chinese. There is apparently some negotiation going on, or a start of a possible negotiation. Finally, for the European Union, what's most important is not that you put these tariffs on, it's that our industry is not exposed to this unfair competition by the Chinese. We all want to go in the same direction, which is indeed the electrification of mobility, diminishing the emissions, yes, of course, but that cannot be done in a way that you are destroying the European industry. We have to protect our industry from these unfair subsidies by the Chinese. And now the process is ongoing. I mean, this investigation by the Commission is still ongoing. These tariffs can actually be, of course, they can even disappear if the Chinese stop subsidizing their cars, or the tariffs could even go higher, because the investigation will go on, and we'll see now what's the willingness of the Chinese to stop this kind of subsidization.
Yes, we have a provisional percentage of tariffs that will be applied, but nothing definitive until November.
Exactly.
That's right. Yeah.
It's because the process is a long process.
Yeah.
And again, as I said, the objective in the end is not that we collect these tariffs, is that we don't have this unfair competition by the Chinese industry.
Marco Campomenosi, what about the role of Germany in all this? Because it seems that the German economy minister is trying to somehow mitigate this EU decision. And of course, your party in Italy, Lega, has been very critical of the German position.
Yes, of course, because this is a story which is not starting today, because it's since the Commission led by President Prodi, Romano Prodi, that this way of being so nice with China, with their unfair competition is going on. Because even Mrs. Merkel governments were thinking that Germany could have had a position of force on this, exporting more to China, and the cost would have been paid by the French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, all the other industries in Europe. Now, Germany is looking at this situation because the automotive sector has difficulties, and so there are some new reactions on that. But I think this is late anyway. These interventions with trade tariffs are late because European Commission has made mistakes, in my opinion, because of this hyper legislation on the transition. No one is respecting any more WTO rules. United States as well, with Inflation Reduction Act. US has declared, okay, we want to give to the American families cars, electric cars, but these cars have to be built at 40% at least in the US. This is a protectionist intervention, but they had to defend themselves from China competition. So the same has to make Europe. So I hope that next Commission will be very consistent on these things.
Pedro Marques, what are the other areas you think where the EU could also send this kind of signal on Chinese trade practices?
Well, I mean, in general, this has been a constant situation. We are. I mean, the time of naiveness, let's call it like that, regarding the trade policy, I think it's gone. The European Union will, because we have to be more autonomous, we have to produce our own goods, and we could see through the COVID crisis that that was not the case in many areas. So I guess we will have a stronger trade policy in the future. I would not at this stage prefer to highlight this or that sector, but what I see is that Europe will, I mean, in a world that is today much more confrontational, Europe will also try to protect our own interests. And I think that's correct. Even if, of course, I don't expect the world to be at a trade war continuously. That's not the objective. But I expect us to protect more our industries in the near future. I think that will be the stance of Europe in the rest of this decade.
And so what do you make of the Chinese rhetoric in relation to this measure, that it could lead to a trade war, or that it's going to hurt Europe? I mean, obviously this was all expected, but is it true?
No, this is exactly what I was expecting, what everybody was expecting. They would always counteract. Now they decided to single out some sectors in which we export significantly to China. I mean, hopefully in the end, as I said in the beginning, it's not about putting these tariffs. In the end, I prefer that we don't have the tariffs, but that our industry is not being harmed by the subsidies of the Chinese. So I guess we will be more active in this trade policy, and hopefully the Chinese will realize that this way of competing with us, and certainly the Americans, it's no longer possible. That's where we are heading, in my opinion.
Yeah. And Marco Campobanossi, about the question of electric vehicles versus traditional vehicles, because of course the group that you're part of in the parliament, it wants to continue with the internal combustion engines. So some people watching this might think, well, why does he care about electric vehicles anyway?
Yeah, but what we did was to say things that now are declared by other parties as well, because they know now that it was a mistake. Because of course the industry has to be subsidized in order to go forward implementation of green policies. Why not? But we cannot impose them a solution without alternatives. So the electrification will impose a lot of costs. And now also we know very well, even on fuels, the news from Lufthansa, but also from the maritime sectors, the cost will be given to the consumers. So, and what will happen when these subsidies will end? Which will be the level of competitiveness of our system, industrial system in Europe? We have seen important producers in automotive sector which are moving investments from Europe to the United States. It's not a matter of cost of workers. It's a matter of having a legislative system which is helping industry in order to develop. And this has happened last year. And I think that if Mr. Trump will win, and I support Republicans in the United States, I think that these questions will be more and more important because they will make their own interests. And so I think in the coming years, and I remember, the trade policies are an exclusive competence of the European Commission. This is something important. Member states may of course, push and make their own interests, but the European Commission has to take decisions because in the last 5 years we did not have any trade policy in Europe.
I want to ask you both, as we don't have a lot of time left, about the broader questions of human rights and European Union leverage on China or not, because I know you've both spoken about this in the hemicycle. Pedro Marques, do you think that the European Parliament could or should take a tougher approach on those questions? And if so, what would that actually consist of?
I mean, as you know, we have had a very tough stance regarding China because of the situation of the Uyghurs, or the situation of the attacks on the democracy in Hong Kong, to give you another example, or the situation in Taiwan. So we have been very vocal on that. I mean, as you know, even some of MEPs, including one of the most prominent in my group, Raphael Glucksmann, they were even sanctioned by the Chinese because exactly they were voicing this opposition to the way how the regime in China is playing on human rights, and we need to continue that way. And we cannot compromise on human rights. We were always against those attacks to democracy, against those attacks to the human rights. And with the Chinese, there's a lot going on. I mean, there's also actions by the Americans, by us, and we need to keep on, I mean, showing our strength. Europe is no longer at this stage, I think. As I said, the world is more confrontational. The big regional blocs are confronting each other. And we I mean, we also have to show that we have our own strengths. Trade is one of our strengths. The capacity of our industries is one of our strengths. But there have to be many others.
Just a quick word on actions, though. You mentioned it briefly, but what are those things concretely?
No, I mean, as you know, we, for instance, here in the Parliament, we said we will not ratify the investment agreement with China until these sanctions, for instance, are removed, until we see significant changes on the human rights stance in China. So this is an example of a concrete consequence that this Parliament took on its hands under the leadership of many groups, but certainly also mine, that we said no investment agreement without a proper change of the situation.
What actions would you like to see going forward?
The Parliament, it's true, has done its job, because we have also supported all the resolutions on Russia, on China, for respecting of human rights, not only the issue for Hong Kong. I signed all the resolutions on these topics. But finally, the European Commission, with a Socialist High Representative on Foreign Affairs, has never implemented this request by the Parliament. It has happened for China, it has happened for Iran, it has happened for many issues. So it has been a pity, because this has had also consequences on our industries, because the European Commission is afraid for the retaliations that China could make on trade sector. But this is only the way they know from Peking regarding dealing political issues with our continent. And this is something we have to fight against, because it's not the way to deal with these international issues. We have to be stronger on these matters.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to both of my guests, Pedro Marques and Marco Campomenosi. That's all for this edition of Talking Europe. Thanks for watching.